There is a body on a Harlem street. It is January 1990, and the night is so cold the blood barely spreads before it starts to set. No wallet taken, no jewelry touched. This was not a robbery, this was a message. The man on the ground had once been untouchable. He had once moved through Harlem like royalty, the kind of young black man who made older hustlers stop and watch because you do not see that combination of charm, brains, and nerve very often. He had money in quantities that most people in his neighborhood could not count out loud without their voice breaking. He had a partner, a brother. Someone who ate with him, slept on his couch, learned the game sitting right beside him. And that partner is the reason he is face down on this street. Let me paint the picture for you. We are talking about a friendship that built a fortune, estimated by the streets at hundreds of thousands of dollars a week at its peak. We are talking about a kidnapping that put a price on a child's head. We are talking about a man who had the money to save that child and chose to let the clock run out. And then, when the heat closed in from every direction, that same man put a bullet in his best friend, walked into a federal building, and traded 30 years of secrets for his own survival. His name was Alpo Martinez. The streets called him Alpo, and the man on the ground was Richard Porter. The streets called him Rich. This is the story of Harlem's most celebrated friendship and its most savage ending. To understand what Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez meant to Harlem, you have to understand what Harlem was before they got there. Not the Harlem of the Renaissance, not the mythology, the real one. The one that existed in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when the neighborhood had been carved up and bled out by heroin for the better part of 2 decades. The older generation of Harlem hustlers had built their names on heroin. Leroy Nicky Barnes ran an operation so sophisticated that Time magazine put him on its cover in 1977 under the headline, Mr. Untouchable. Frank Lucas smuggled heroin in the coffins of American soldiers returning from Vietnam, a detail so cold it sounds like fiction. These men were not footnotes. They were the architecture that the next generation inherited, the proof that Harlem streets could produce men who moved product on a scale that rivaled corporate distribution networks. But by the early 1980s, both Barnes and Lucas were done. Barnes had flipped on his own people to cut his sentence, a move that sent shockwaves through every corner in the city. Lucas was in and out of legal trouble, his empire long dismantled. The throne was empty, and into that vacuum walked crack cocaine. Crack hit New York like a freight train with no brakes. It was cheaper than powder, faster than heroin, and it spread through neighborhoods that were already economically gutted by a city that had essentially written them off. Harlem in 1983 and 1984 was a neighborhood with shuttered storefronts, no real investment, and a generation of young men who were watching the generation before them either dead, locked up, or cooperating. The crack era did not create the conditions for men like Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez. The conditions created the crack era. They just happened to arrive at exactly the right moment. Richard Porter grew up on 130th Street. His family had money by Harlem standards, and that upbringing gave him something rare in the drug game, a baseline of confidence that did not come from desperation. Rich was not out there because he had no other option. He was out there because he wanted to be, and that distinction showed in how he carried himself. He had style. He had magnetism. People wanted to be around him, wanted his approval, wanted to be in his orbit. In a world where most men lead through fear, Rich Porter led through something closer to love. Alberto Martinez grew up different. Born in 1966, Alpo came up in Harlem with considerably less cushion than Rich. His hunger was real and literal, and it showed in the way he moved, calculating, fast, always looking for the angle. Where Rich had warmth, Alpo had precision. Where Rich built loyalty through generosity, Alpo built it through fear and through the kind of cold competence that makes people follow you because they are Not entirely sure what happens if they do not, but here's the thing about that kind of power on the streets. The two of them together were something neither of them was separately. They came up alongside a third figure, Aziz Faison, known in Harlem as AZ. The three of them, Rich, Alpo, and AZ, formed the nucleus of what would become one of the most talked about crews Harlem had seen since the heroin days. AZ would later tell his story publicly, and his account forms much of what we understand about this era from the inside. He has said in interviews that the money they were generating in the mid-1980s was staggering, that Harlem had not seen young black men moving that kind of weight in that way in years. He eventually survived a near-fatal shooting in 1987 that pulled him out of the game before the worst of what came next. But while he was there, while all three of them were running together, 130th Street felt like the center of the universe. And that is not hyperbole. That is documentation. Rap music was becoming the street's newspaper by the mid-1980s. And the names Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez were already showing up in lyrics before either of them had reached the full height of their operation. That tells you something about the scale of their reputation. You do not get name dropped in verses because you are doing well. You get name dropped because you have become myth while you are still alive. The crew moved cocaine. They were connected to suppliers that allowed them to operate at a volume that most street-level organizations could not touch. They drove the cars, wore the clothes, and projected the image that made Harlem kids grow up wanting to be them. I will be honest, when you go back and look at photographs of Rich Porter from this era, there is something almost painful about it. He looks like exactly what the street said he was. Young, sharp, alive with potential. And knowing what comes next makes those images hit different. By the late 1980s, the operation had expanded. Alpo, in particular, had pushed into Washington, D.C., setting up distribution there that extended the reach of the whole network well beyond Harlem. D.C. was a different kind of city, a different kind of violence, and Alpo moved through it with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything. Federal court documents would later confirm his presence and his activities in D.C. during this period. He was not just a Harlem figure anymore. He was a regional player. But every story about men who build as fast has the same hidden clock running underneath it. The clock was running on Rich and Alpo too. They just could not hear it yet. Do the math on what they were doing and the exposure that comes with it. You are moving serious weight, you are visible, you are famous in your neighborhood, your name is in songs, and you are operating in an era when law enforcement is pouring resources into exactly the kind of network you are running. The DEA, local task forces, federal wiretaps, all of it was expanding in response to the crack epidemic. Every day you stayed on top was another day the infrastructure closing around you got a little tighter. But that was not even their biggest problem. In late 1989 or early 1990, which is the documented time frame based on what followed, Richard Porter's younger brother, Donald Porter, was kidnapped. Donald was a child. He was not in the game the way his brother was. He was leverage, pure and simple. Whoever took him was sending a message to Rich, a message written in the language the streets understand best. Pay up or bury your brother. I have been telling these stories for years, and this particular moment still messes me up every time I come back to it. Because what happens next is not a story about gangland violence in the abstract. It is a story about a brother who spent everything he had trying to save a child, and a partner who had the resources to help and chose to calculate instead of act. The ransom demand, by multiple accounts and subsequent reporting, was significant. Rich scrambled. He moved money, called in favors, did everything a man does when the most important thing in the world is on the clock. And Alpo Martinez, his partner, his brother in all but blood, had money. By any reasonable accounting of what their operation was generating, Alpo had the funds to contribute meaningfully to that ransom without materially damaging his own position. He did not move fast enough. Donald Porter was found dead. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not the death itself, which is its own horror. I want you to sit with what it means that the man sitting on the money that might have saved that child was the same man who called himself Rich's closest partner. The streets noticed. The streets always notice. The thing I keep coming back to is what Rich Porter must have known in the days after Donald was killed. You do not build an operation the way they built theirs without developing a very refined ability to read people. Rich would have understood what Alpo's inaction meant. He would have understood it in his bones. And yet the partnership did not immediately collapse. These things never collapse immediately. They corrode. But the streets had other plans. By 1990, the pressure on Alpo from multiple directions was becoming unsustainable. Law enforcement was moving. His DC operation had generated the kind of heat that does not dissipate. There were bodies connected to his name, and in the drug world, bodies mean witnesses, and witnesses mean deals, and deals mean someone is about to hand you to the federal government wrapped in a bow. There were also internal tensions that had been building since Donald's murder. Rich Porter was not a man who forgot things. And in a world where trust is the only real currency, a partner who sits on ransom money while your little brother is being held has already made a decision about where his loyalty ends. And that decision was about to cost everything. In January 1990, Richard Porter was shot and killed in Harlem. He was 24 years old. The official investigation into his murder stretched across years. No immediate arrests, no quick resolution. Just a family without a son, a neighborhood without its king, and a partner who went quiet. The case eventually cracked open the way these cases always do, not through brilliant detective work, but through the oldest mechanism in the criminal justice system. Somebody talked. Alberto Martinez was arrested in the early 1990s, facing federal charges that carried the kind of weight that buries a man for the rest of his life. Alpo Martinez made the same calculation he had always made. He looked at the numbers, assessed his position, and chose survival. He cooperated with the federal government. He provided testimony that implicated others in the DC drug trade, and in doing so, he confirmed what the streets had already suspected about the murder of Rich Porter. The Washington Post would report on aspects of his cooperation and sentencing in the years that followed. Federal court records confirmed that Martinez pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors, receiving a significantly reduced sentence in exchange. By the government's own accounting, Alpo Martinez admitted to committing multiple murders, including the murder of Richard Porter. He received a sentence that, given the scope of what he confessed to, was widely described in Harlem and in legal circles as extraordinarily lenient. He served roughly 2 decades before being released. I'll be honest, when I first went deep into the documentation on this one, the sentencing number stopped me cold. You confess to killing your best friend, you confess to additional murders, and you walk after 20 years because you handed the government enough information about enough other people that they decided your freedom was worth the trade. That is not justice by any traditional definition. That is arithmetic, cold federal arithmetic. Rich Porter's story has been widely referenced in hip-hop, with figures like Jay-Z and Nas folding the mythology of this Harlem era into their early work. The names Rich, Alpo, and AZ became shorthand for a whole chapter of New York street history, the crack era's royalty, the men who built the most and fell the hardest. Ozzy Faison has spoken publicly about this period in various interviews, and his account helped inspire the 2002 dramatized film Paid in Full, which changed names and details. But the bones of the story are the bones of what happened on 130th Street. When asked directly about Alpo's betrayal, Faison has been measured but unambiguous. The friendship was real, the money was real, and what Alpo did was real. What the documentary and the film could not fully capture was the texture of the grief that settled over Harlem when Rich Porter died. Because Rich Porter was not just a drug dealer to that neighborhood, he was the proof that a young black man from 130th Street could command the kind of wealth and respect that the city otherwise denied him. His death did not just remove a person, it removed a possibility. And the manner of it, killed by the man who was supposed to be his brother, added a dimension of betrayal that the neighborhood never fully processed. Alpo was released from federal custody and entered the witness protection program. For years, his whereabouts were unknown, which is the point of the program. But Alpo Martinez was never very good at disappearing, or maybe he did not want to. Witness protection is designed to make people vanish, but people do not always follow the plan. Reports began surfacing in the late 2010s that he had returned to Harlem. Photographs circulated on social media. He was giving interviews. He was talking to documentarians. He was, by multiple accounts, living with a visibility that made people who understood his history deeply uneasy. You do not cooperate with the federal government against the people you came up with and then stroll back through the neighborhood where those people's families still live. The streets do not forget. The streets do not do witness protection. On October 31st, 2021, Alberto Martinez was shot and killed in Harlem. He was 55 years old. He was shot in a drive-by shooting in the early morning hours. No one has been officially charged with his murder as of this telling. The specifics of what happened that Halloween morning are still being pieced together. What is not in dispute is that the man who betrayed Rich Porter, who sat on ransom money while a child died, who confessed to his best friend's murder and traded that confession for a reduced sentence, died on the streets of the same neighborhood where all of it started. Rich Porter has a memorial in Harlem. His name shows up in verses by some of the greatest rappers who ever lived. He is remembered as a king. Alpo Martinez has a complicated YouTube legacy and a murder case that nobody seems to be racing to solve. And somewhere in the story of those two different endings is the entire moral logic of the streets. Brutal, ironic, and absolutely relentless in the way it accounts for everything eventually. That body in Washington, D.C., the one we open with, that is still the center of this story. Rich Porter, 24 years old, face down on a cold street, killed by the man who ate at his table. The cold has long since set in around that image, but the question it raises never gets comfortable. How does a friendship built on loyalty become the instrument of the most savage betrayal Harlem ever witnessed? The block knows the answer. It just does not say it out loud. Click here to check out another video and click here to subscribe.